May 1963. The most notorious prison in the world was closing its doors. But for one man, the real story was just beginning. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson stepped through the iron gates of Alcatraz not as a broken convict, but as a returning sovereign. He had spent 10 years on the rock, 10 years of silence, 10 years of planning. While he was gone, the world had changed. The Harlem he left in the early 50s was a patchwork of jazz, local numbers kings, and street-level respect. The Harlem he was returning to in 1963 was a powder keg. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was watching. The 5 families of the Italian mafia were waiting. And the streets? The streets were hungry for a leader they hadn't seen in a decade. To understand the war, you have to understand the math. In the 1960s, Harlem didn't trust Wall Street, and Wall Street didn't care about Harlem. Instead, the neighborhood had the numbers. It was a poor man's lottery. You could bet a penny, a nickel, or a dime on a 3-digit sequence. It was a game of hope played on every street corner, in every barber shop, and behind every deli counter. But it wasn't just gambling. The numbers was the unofficial bank of the black community. It funded small businesses, paid for funerals, and kept the lights on when the banks refused to give a black man a loan. By 1963, the Harlem numbers game was generating an estimated $50 million a year. That's nearly $500 million in today's money. And in the eyes of the 5 families, that was too much money to be left in the hands of the locals. The Genovese family, operating out of the Palma Boys Social Club in East Harlem, decided it was time to consolidate. Fat Tony Salerno didn't just want a piece of the action, he wanted the whole board. The mafia's strategy was simple: intimidation. They began sending inspectors, low-level soldiers and associates, into Harlem's bars and lounges. These men didn't look like the neighbors. They wore expensive overcoats, smelled of heavy cologne, and carried the silent threat of the 5 families behind them. Their message to the local numbers bankers was brutal. From now on, 20% of every bet comes to us. Call it a tax, call it protection. Just make sure the envelope is full on Friday. For a few weeks, the tax worked. The local bankers were terrified. They remembered what happened to people who stood up to the Genovese family. People disappeared. Businesses burned. The mafia soldiers became arrogant. They started walking into legendary spots like the Wells restaurant or the Palm Cafe as if they owned the chairs they sat in. They were loud. They were disrespectful. They treated Harlem like a conquered province. They thought Bumpy Johnson was watching from the sidelines, too old to fight, too tired to care. They assumed his time in Alcatraz had drained his spirit. They mistook his silence for surrender. Then came the night at the lounge. 3 Genovese soldiers walked in, expecting their weekly envelope. But this time, the banker wasn't alone. Bumpy Johnson was sitting in the back booth. He didn't have a crew with him. He didn't have a gun on the table. He was just sipping a coffee. The mobsters, emboldened by their own hype, walked right up to him. One of them reportedly laughed and asked Bumpy if he had his tax ready too. Bumpy stood up. The room went cold. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten their families. He leaned in close enough for them to see the scars on his face and whispered 3 words that changed the course of New York history. Not mine. Harlem. He told them they had 5 minutes to get across 110th Street, and that if he ever saw their faces in a Harlem lounge again, they wouldn't be walking back. The soldiers looked around. They realized they weren't just looking at Bumpy. They were looking at every waiter, every patron, and every passerby in the street who had stopped to watch. They were surrounded by a neighborhood that had found its backbone. They left. That night, the word reached East Harlem. Bumpy Johnson had officially declared Harlem a no-tax zone. He had challenged the most powerful criminal organization in the world to a game of chicken. The numbers war had begun, and for the first time in a decade, the mafia realized they weren't fighting a gangster. They were fighting a king. By 1964, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a nuisance. He was a strategic nightmare for the Commission, the ruling body of the American mafia. Normally, the solution for a problem, like Bumpy, was a hit. But Bumpy wasn't an ordinary target. The mafia's leadership, including Carlo Gambino, understood a dangerous truth. Killing Bumpy Johnson would set Harlem on fire. It wouldn't just be a gang war. It would be a race riot that would bring the full weight of the U.S. government down on every Italian social club from Brooklyn to the Bronx. Bumpy knew this. He used the social climate of the 60s as a suit of armor. Bumpy didn't fight like a mobster. He fought like a guerrilla. He knew he couldn't win a head-on battle against 5,000 made men. Instead, he hit their pockets. He organized local lookouts, teenagers, doormen, and street vendors to identify any outside car that crossed into Harlem. When mafia-owned trucks tried to deliver goods or collect payments, they found their tires slashed, their engines tampered with, or their drivers talked to by a dozen men who didn't exist 5 minutes prior. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Bumpy was making it more expensive for the mafia to stay in Harlem than it was to leave. But Bumpy wasn't just being watched by the mob. The FBI had a permanent detail assigned to him. They bugged his favorite booths at Wells' restaurant. They sat in parked cars outside the Teresa Hotel for 24 hours a day. The receipts from these files reveal a man who was obsessed with code. Bumpy rarely spoke directly about business. He talked in metaphors about poetry, chess moves, and shipping costs. He knew the feds were listening, so he turned their surveillance into a weapon. He would intentionally feed the FBI false information about the Italians, using the Bureau as an unwitting tool to disrupt mafia operations while he sat back and watched the chaos. Bumpy's greatest move on the chessboard was his understanding of the law. He didn't just break it, he manipulated it. He hired the best lawyers and ensured that every time a mafia soldier tried to lean on a Harlem business owner, the police were called, not by Bumpy, but by anonymous citizens. He forced the mafia to operate in the light, where they were vulnerable, while he stayed in the shadows where he was king. He was outplaying the Italians at their own game, the art of the sit-down. He made it clear that if they wanted peace, they had to negotiate, not as bosses to a subordinate, but as equals. By the mid-60s, a cold peace settled over Manhattan. The mafia still had their hands in the pie, but Bumpy Johnson held the knife. He had successfully created a state within a state. He was the primary mediator for all disputes in Harlem. If the Italians had a problem, they went through Bumpy. If the feds had a lead, they ran into a wall of silence. The king was back on his throne, but as every chess player knows, the most dangerous part of the game is the endgame. And for Bumpy Johnson, the endgame was approaching faster than anyone realized. In the mid-60s, Harlem was the center of two very different worlds. One was the underworld of Bumpy Johnson, a world of numbers, razors, and secret ledgers. The other was the political world of Malcolm X, a world of revolution, faith, and the struggle for black liberation. On the surface, they had nothing in common, but in the eyes of the law, they were the two most dangerous men in the city. And in the shadows of 125th Street, their paths aligned. The alliance began out of necessity. After Malcolm X split from the Nation of Islam in 1964, he became a marked man. He knew the death threats were real. He knew his house was being watched, and he knew that the police wouldn't protect him. In fact, he believed they wanted him gone. Malcolm reached out to the only man in New York who had more eyes on the street than the FBI, Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy respected Malcolm's courage. He saw Malcolm as a man who was fighting for the dignity of Harlem, the same neighborhood Bumpy considered his own. Bumpy put out a quiet order. Every street hustler, every lookout, and every brother on the corner was told that Malcolm X was untouchable. If anyone moved against the minister, they weren't just fighting the Nation of Islam. They were fighting Bumpy Johnson. For a time, the protection worked. But Malcolm X was a man of principle. He began to feel that being protected by a legendary racketeer sent the wrong message to the youth of Harlem. In late 1964, Malcolm met with Bumpy and told him he was ending the arrangement. He thanked him for his service, but said he had to rely on his own people. Bumpy, ever the strategist, reportedly warned him, "Malcolm, you can't fight these people with just faith. They don't play by the rules." Malcolm stood his ground. Bumpy withdrew his men. It was a decision that would haunt the streets of Harlem for decades. When the news broke that Malcolm X had been gunned down at the Audubon Ballroom, Bumpy Johnson didn't say a word. According to those close to him, he sat in his usual booth at the back of the Wells restaurant and stared at the door for hours. This is the contradiction of Bumpy Johnson. He was a man who grew rich on the vices of his people, yet he was the only man powerful enough to offer them protection when the system failed. The alliance with Malcolm X proved that Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He was a political player who understood that power in Harlem was about more than just money. It was about autonomy. But with Malcolm gone, the pressure on Bumpy began to mount. The Five family saw a weakness. The feds saw an opening. And Bumpy was beginning to realize that even a king can't hold back the tide of history forever. For over 50 years, Hollywood has been obsessed with the image of Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. We've seen him played as a tragic hero, a stone-cold killer, and a social revolutionary. From Lawrence Fishburne's gritty performance in Hoodlum to Forest Whitaker's calculated chess player in Godfather of Harlem, the screen version of Bumpy is always larger than life. But there is a problem. Hollywood needs a hero or a villain. The streets of Harlem needed a survivor. The real Bumpy Johnson didn't look like a movie star. He was a man of medium build, with a face scarred by early street fights and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. While Forest Whitaker portrays him as a man constantly struggling with his morality, the historical record suggests something much more chilling. Bumpy Johnson was a man who had entirely reconciled his violence with his business. He didn't agonize over his decisions in dramatic monologues. He made them with the cold precision of a mathematician. To understand the real Bumpy, we have to look past the cinematic gunfights and look at the receipts, the FBI files, the court transcripts, and the memories of the people who actually stood in his shadow. In the movies, Bumpy is often seen taking on the Italian mafia single-handedly, standing in the middle of the street with a Thompson submachine gun. In Hoodlum, he goes to war with Dutch Schultz in a series of high-octane set pieces. But in the real underworld of the 1930s and 60s, a man who stayed in the streets with a gun didn't live long enough to become a legend. The real Bumpy Johnson was an expert in proximal power. He rarely pulled a trigger himself. Instead, he managed a sophisticated hierarchy. He had enforcers like Junie Bird, men whose names alone could stop a heart. Hollywood misses the most terrifying part of Bumpy's power, his silence. FBI surveillance logs from the 1960s show that Bumpy spent the majority of his time in quiet conversation. He didn't scream. He didn't throw chairs. He whispered. He understood that in New York, the man who makes the most noise is the first one the feds pick up. His war with the Italians wasn't a series of street battles. It was a series of strategic accidents and financial chokes. He didn't need to kill every Genovese soldier. He just had to make it unprofitable for them to stay. Hollywood gives us a warrior. History gives us a CEO with a razor. One thing Hollywood actually gets right is Bumpy's love for chess. But they often use it as a simple metaphor for thinking ahead. For the real Bumpy, chess wasn't a hobby. It was his philosophy. While incarcerated at Alcatraz in Dannemora, Bumpy didn't just lift weights. He consumed books. He studied history, philosophy, and poetry. He was known as the professor by some of his inmates. He wrote poetry that was actually published in local journals, verses that spoke of the struggle of the black man in a white-dominated system. This intellectual depth is what made him so dangerous to the Five families. The Italian bosses, men like Lucky Luciano and Carlo Gambino, were used to dealing with street thugs they could easily manipulate. Bumpy was different. He spoke their language of respect and honor, but he also understood the legal system and the political landscape better than they did. He didn't just play chess on a board. He played it with the NYPD, the FBI, and the Commission. He knew when to sacrifice a pawn, a low-level runner, to protect his queen, his primary numbers beg. This mental discipline is why he survived for 40 years while every other black kingpin of his era ended up in a casket or a life sentence. In Godfather of Harlem, the sit-downs are cinematic clashes of ego. In reality, a sit-down with the Five families was a ritual governed by the code. You have to remember, Bumpy Johnson was one of the few black men in history invited to sit at the table with the Commission. There were 3 rules Hollywood never shows. First, neutrality. A sit-down never happened in Bumpy's lounge or the Mafia's social club. It happened in a safe house, often a back room of a funeral parlor or a basement of a church. Second, the no-weapon rule. To bring a gun to a sit-down was an admission of weakness. Bumpy would walk into a room filled with Genovese captains completely unarmed. That was his ultimate power move. Third, the resolution. You did not leave until a deal was made. Bumpy was a master of the long wait. He would sit in total silence for 20 minutes, staring at his opponent, until they felt the need to speak just to break the tension. He understood the psychology of the made man. He knew they were obsessed with their own image of toughness. By staying calm and academic, He made them feel like children. He didn't win his independence with bullets. He won it by being the most disciplined man in the room. Finally, we have to talk about the Robin Hood of Harlem. Hollywood loves to show Bumpy as a saint of the streets, feeding the hungry and paying the rent. And while the stories are true, he did buy coal for the poor and turkeys for the hungry. It wasn't just charity. It was the ultimate insurance policy. In the 1960s, the FBI was desperate to flip someone on Bumpy. They offered money, immunity, and relocation to dozens of Harlem residents. Not one person took the deal. Why? Because Bumpy had made himself the government. If the city didn't pick up the trash, Bumpy's men did. If a landlord was abusive, Bumpy's men fixed it. He didn't just buy their loyalty, he earned their silence. Hollywood shows a hero. The receipts show a man who understood that a neighborhood that loves you is a fortress that the feds can never breach. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968, at Wells Restaurant. He wasn't gunned down in a dramatic finale. He died eating fried chicken and drinking coffee, a free man. Hollywood will keep making movies about him, and they will keep getting it wrong. Because the real story isn't about the violence. It's about a man who looked at the most powerful criminal organization in the world and said, "I will not bow." He was the last of the street kings, and once he was gone, the rules died with him. Subscribe for the real history. By July of 1968, the legend of Bumpy Johnson was no longer just about the man himself. It was about the survival of an era that was rapidly slipping away. The New York City heat that summer was oppressive, thick with the humidity of the Atlantic and the simmering tension of a country on the brink of a nervous breakdown. The political landscape of America had shifted violently. Just months earlier, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had sent shockwaves through every black community in the nation. Harlem had burned in the riots of 1964, and the scars were still visible in the boarded-up windows and the heightened presence of the NYPD's tactical units. The heroin epidemic, once a trickle, was becoming a flood. While Bumpy had built his empire on the numbers game, a relatively clean racket that functioned as a community bank, the new money was in the needle. And with the needle came a level of violence and social decay that even Bumpy couldn't fully control. On the night of July 7th, 1968, the routine was no different than any other Sunday for the past 5 years. Bumpy didn't seek out the shadows. He lived in the center of the light. He made his way to 2247 Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard, the site of the legendary Wells Restaurant. It was Bumpy's unofficial office. He was accompanied by his oldest and most trusted confidant, Junie Bird. They were two men who had seen the rise and fall of Dutch Schultz, the consolidation of the five families, and the transition of Harlem from a cultural mecca to a battlefield of the Cold War. As the clock ticked toward 2 a.m. on July 8th, the atmosphere in the restaurant was calm. Bumpy ordered his final meal, a plate of fried chicken and a cup of black coffee. As he reached for the sugar, Bumpy's hand froze. A sharp, crushing pain radiated through his chest, a massive congestive heart failure. He didn't have time for a grand monologue or a final instruction to his lieutenants. He simply leaned back against the red vinyl of the booth, his breath catching in his throat. Junie Bird realized immediately what was happening, but by the time the ambulance arrived, the King of Harlem was already slipping into history. The news of his death didn't just travel, it detonated. Within an hour, the phone lines between the Harlem social clubs and the Italian social clubs in East Harlem were buzzing. The immediate reaction wasn't one of celebration, it was one of profound anxiety. For the Genovese family, Bumpy had been a necessary friction. Without Bumpy, there was no mediator. The power vacuum was instantaneous and terrifying. Bumpy's funeral was an event that New York City had never seen before and has never seen since. It was a state funeral for a man the state had spent half a century trying to imprison. Over 5,000 people flooded the streets around the Abyssinian Baptist Church. In the front pews sat the old guard, the racketeers who had come up with Bumpy in the 30s. And scattered throughout were the feds, their cameras clicking. The procession to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx was miles long. As the black hearse moved slowly up 7th Avenue, people stood on the fire escapes and the sidewalks in total silence. They weren't just mourning a man, they were mourning the end of an era of Harlem's independence. Bumpy was buried in a spot that reflected his status, but even as the dirt was being shoveled onto his casket, the world he had built was already beginning to crumble. The immediate successor to Bumpy's influence was his protege, Frank Lucas. But Lucas was a different kind of man. While Bumpy was a chess player, Lucas was a merchant of the heroin trade. He didn't want the numbers game. He wanted to monopolize the drug flow from the Golden Triangle. Without Bumpy's moral compass, the heroin epidemic accelerated, hollowing out the neighborhood's soul. The receipts of history show that Bumpy Johnson's true legacy wasn't the money or the enemies. It was the fact that for 5 decades, he forced the most powerful criminal organization in the world to treat a black man as an equal. He showed that intelligence and strategy were more lethal than any weapon. He was the professor who proved that even in the darkest corners of the underworld, you could still hold onto your dignity. Harlem has changed. The Wells restaurant is gone, replaced by the march of gentrification. But if you stand on 125th Street at 2 a.m. and listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of the era Bumpy built. You can hear the rustle of the ledger, the click of the chess piece, and the whispered 3 words that once stopped a war. The king is dead, but the legend of Bumpy Johnson remains the bedrock of Harlem's history. He was the last of the street kings, a man who lived by the code and died in the heart of the neighborhood he loved. Subscribe to keep the real history alive, because the receipts don't lie.